This over here is the RTX 4080 Super, and I have got some very, very good news. We're getting a cheaper GPU with more performance, but how good is it? Is it better than the 4080? And what about some of the AMD offerings? Is it still worth it because AMD's best GPU, the 7900 XTX, is now discounted? Well, let's check it out.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out Whokeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20
to get 25% off. Use your preferred payment method including PayPal or bank card. Go to your orders and copy the key.
Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free.
Or you can buy Windows 11 Pro key instead.
They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20
to get 25% off.
Check out whokeys.com in the video description below.
So firstly, if you want to check out these GPUs, I'm going to leave them in the description below. But I have an RTX 4080 and 4080 Super here from Zotac. The one in the middle is the 4080 Super, and this is the 4080, and this is exactly the same model, the AMP AIRO. And as you can see, they are completely identical. There is absolutely nothing different in these. There is no difference. You can see they're completely identical in every single way. The only difference that I have found is actually on the back plate here. So if we're looking at the Super here, they've actually improved this fin design in here. They've kind of folded them onto together, so they're a little bit more stronger, whereas these fins are flapping around because they have no strength or rigidity on this side of the end. Also looks like they've changed the SMD providers or the actual make of them, because the Supers here use slightly different SMDs there, or the capacitors, whatever they are there. Slightly different color in here. But what I have here is the RTX 4080 Super TUF from ASUS. And this guy is exactly the same size as the 4090 from ASUS TUF as well. So the same cooler, everything same design. The interesting difference between the ASUS and the Zotac design here is that ASUS has much bigger pass-through. The 12-volt high power connector is flipped, so on the ASUS it's on the other side, and ASUS's side is a better way because it's easier to remove it if you ever need to change the GPU, because the actual clip goes on the top rather than on the bottom. It's hard to get your finger in there like that on the Zotac. And then if we're looking at the I/O of these GPUs, then you can see that the ASUS one actually has extra HDMI port. Now, it still supports 4 displays, but instead of using 1 display port, or if you have we don't have enough display ports, for example, you can use 2 HDMI and then do 2 display ports to actually get 4 display outputs. On the Zotac, we only have 1 HDMI and 3 display ports, but the Zotac card is actually like a 3-slot card, which kind of makes sense. I'm not sure why ASUS didn't do that. It should have been 3 as well, because you're going to get better grip on the PC case when you've got 3 slots. You can get 3 screws built in, but the ASUS card is very, very solid. It's like out of 1 piece of metal, all of this in here. Zotac one is made out of plastic, so ASUS one does feel a little bit of a better quality. Now in a moment you're going to see which card is actually better, but there is actually a price difference between these cards, and you're going to go check it out in the video description below if you want to know which one is better or worse. Now let's take a look at the specs real quick, and as you can see, compared to the non-Super of the 4080, we only have 2 4080s, so it's a little bit more clearer than the 4070 lineup where we have 4 4070s. It's absolutely insane. The 4080 will be history now. They're probably still going to sell it, but they don't produce it anymore, so you might find some on sale, but most likely you're not going to want to buy a 4080, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. The 4080 Super has 5% more CUDA cores, TMUs and RT cores. As you can see now, we're reaching 10,000 cores there, and everything else is the same apart from the price. The RTX 4080 is priced at $1,000, which is $200 discount compared to the 4080, and we're getting slightly faster GPU as well, which is really good. But that's not all, because AMD might have something even better in store. Compared to the RTX 4090, you can see that this is not the same GPU as the 4090, which is AD102. This is AD103. And the 4090 has a lot more shading unit, TMUs, RT cores, and so on, as well as the VRAM, the memory bus, the memory bandwidth. Everything is a lot more on the 4090. Now, I wish we could get a 4090 for $1,600 like its MSRP priced at, but the 4090 goes a lot more than that right now. So On the 4070 Ti Super and on the 4080 Super, the Supers are replacing the non-Supers. The 4070 and 4070 Super will be produced in conjunction of each other. By the way, the interesting thing is if you look at my 4070 Ti Super video, you realize that the 4070 Ti Super is actually a shaved down 4080 rather than a fully saturated 4070 die. The price is awesome about these GPUs because now it's discounted, which means we're just gonna get more performance for the same money, which Nvidia should have done in the first place. But finally, we have the good news. It is the good news. If you want to check out my TESTBENCH setup, I'm going to leave that in the description below as well, so you can check out what other, parts I'm testing for this comparison here. Now, you might have noticed that I've got this guy in the back here. So this is the RTX 4080 from Noctua ASUS. And we're going to be comparing this to this RTX 4080 Super here, because I want to know how much have we got the increase there. We can see we've got 5%, a little bit over 5% extra cores, but does that mean extra 5% performance? We're going to see that. Then the RTX 4090 that we're going to be using in this comparison, we're going to put the Zotac 4090 on the test here. And lastly, we're also going to be using the AMD Radeon 7900 XTX, and I've got the power color version, which is in my Threadripper build over there. So I can't really pull that out, but you'll see some B-roll over here. So let's start looking at the performance differences. In Geekbench 6, we can see that the 4080 is actually about 0.5% faster in the OpenCL scores and about 1% slower than this ASUS TUF version. So the Noctua 4080 actually is performing pretty much neck to neck with this 4080 Super. The 4090 is 32.7% faster in the OpenCL scores and about 10% faster in the Vulkan scores. The AMD card is roughly about 36.7% slower in the OpenCL scores, but about 12.8% faster in the Vulkan scores. Let's take a look at photo editing and Photoshop, and this is PureBench for it. This is 0.93.7, not the 1.0 benchmark, which actually changes the scores. I've got to keep all my scores exactly at the same benchmark, so that's why it's slightly older. The 4080 is actually slightly faster than the 4080 Super in here, as you can see, and so is the 4090 and the 7900 XTX. As you can see, the 7900 XTX is the fastest card in this bunch and is about 20% faster in the GPU scores, about 17% faster in the filter scores, but roughly about the same in general scores. All of these cards are really overkill for you, and you really don't need that. The same for Lightroom Classic, really overkill cards here, and I'm not going to show the benchmark results in Lightroom Classic because they're pretty much exactly the same as everybody else within margin of error, so no need to show you. Moving on to video editing, and this is where things get interesting. We're looking at PureBench 0.98 for Premiere Pro 23.6 here, and you can see that the 4080 is about 1 to 1.9% slower in the extended and standard overall scores. The biggest difference that we can see is in the GPU effects in the standard scores, and there we can see about 5.3% increase in performance, or the 4080 is about 5.3% slower, which actually kind of makes sense because we have 5% extra cores, and the GPU effects here in Premiere Pro really show that this is exactly that. The 4090 is extra 1 to 5% faster than the 4080, and if you don't require the VRAM capacity on the 4090, this 4080 actually is a very good pick, because as you can see, it's very tied with the 4090. The only difference on 4090 is the GPU effects, about 15.9% faster in the extended score and about 4% in the standard overall score. But the actual video codec performance, whether it's intraframe, long GOP or RAW, the 4080 and 4090 actually perform the same. Now, let's add in the AMD card, and you can see that the AMD card is actually 2.3 to 8.3% faster in the standard and extended overall scores. Especially if we're looking at the long GOP score, that's HR264 and HR265, you can see about 30% faster on the AMD card, which is insane. The intraframe score, extended and standard, are about 15 to 16% faster. The raw score is faster on the NVIDIA card, especially the extended, about 7%, and the GPU effects are faster on the 4080 Super, But most likely the AMD card is going to be a better pick just because of the higher VRAM capacity. Moving on to After Effects, and here we can see the 4080 is about 6% slower. 4090 is actually marginally bit faster, but performs within margin of error, which is interesting. The GPU score is faster on the 4090, about 4%, but doesn't really kind of make sense in terms of the price point, unless you need the VRAM capacity. The 7900 XTX is about 2% slower in the overall scores and about 4.7% faster in the GPU scores. I'd say for After Effects, all of these cards are within 5% of each other. That's really not that big of a difference. What about DaVinci Resolve that uses every piece of GPU power you have? The 4080 is about 6.5% roughly slower in the standard and extended overall scores, which is now, okay, quite a big leap compared to the non-super version. Super is quite a bit faster. The RTX 4090 is about 6 to 8% faster in the extended and standard overall scores, but the GPU effects is 35% faster on the 4090, and that's mostly because of the VRAM capacity as well, because DaVinci Resolve loves to use VRAM. But the interesting thing is the 7900 XTX is actually 8 to 12% faster than this 4080 Super. The 4K and 8K media scores are a bit slower, about 2% slower in 4K and 17% in the 8K media scores, but the Fusion and GPU effects scores are faster on the AMD card. So for DaVinci Resolve, as you can see here again, the AMD might be a better pick. Moving on to 3D applications, now the 4080 Super really can stretch its legs and show what it's made of. In V-Ray, in CUDA and RTX scores, the 4090 is 31 and 26% faster in those scores, and the AMD card is not supported on V-Ray. So we're not getting close to the 4090, but we're slightly faster than the non-super 4080. In Blender, the difference isn't that big, about 0.6 to 3.2% slower on the non-super 4080, and about 16 to 22% faster on the 4090. Now, Blender does support the AMD card, but the AMD card is about 55 to 64% slower. But if you look at the scores, you realize that's 2.5 times slower. That is huge difference for Blender. And if you're doing Blender rendering, any of the NVIDIA cards are much better pick than the AMD card. Since we can stretch the legs in 3D, I wanted to know what's the difference between the Zotac and the TUF card. So I did those tests again in Blender with the two different cards, and you can see that the Zotac card is actually slightly faster in classroom scenes, but about 1 to 2.34% slower in monster and chunk shop scenes. So the TUF does actually perform a little bit faster. Moving on to Octanebench, and here we can see that the 4080 is about 4.6% slower, the 4090 is about 20% faster, and again the AMD card is not supported, so no luck there for the AMD guys. But if you're looking at the difference between the TUF and the Zotac version here on the Octanebench, we can see that the Zotac is 0.7% slower, so they're basically identical. Next of all, Redshift, and here we can see that the 4080 is actually 0.6% faster than the 4080 Super, which is very interesting. The 4090 is 27.4% faster, and the 7900 XTX is 44.9% slower, which is almost twice as fast as the 4080 Super. Now, the TUF and the Zotac version difference is about 0.9%, and that is not enough to tell the difference, and Zotac seems to be a little bit of the slower one. So in all of these tests, the TUF card seems to be the faster and better version compared to the Zotac. But we're going to talk about the power draw, because that's where something interesting is happening. Now, when testing the Zotac version of this card, then at first when having the card in there, I'm pulling roughly about 300 watts, 295, something like that, compared to the 320 on the TUF version. After I did the restart, the Zotac card actually does pump up to 310 or something around there watts of power draw. Now, I wanted to see if there's any difference in the MSI Afterburner and the card power draw of how much we can set the limit. And both of these cards, you can set them to 110% power limit, and they perform identical really in there. But the interesting thing is, in the stock settings, the Zotac card pulls actually less power than the ASUS TUF. but the TUF seems to have a little bit higher clock speeds, so hence the performance difference on the TUF there. If we are comparing the power draw between the 4080 and the 4080 Super, then there's no power draw difference there. They're both drawing 320 watts maximum, which is quite a bit less than the 4090, which is 450 watts. The 7900 XTX is pulling about 375 watts, which is actually more than the 4080 Supers, both of them. So the AMD card does pull a lot more power, but is sometimes faster. So what's the conclusion then? Is the 4080 Super worth it for creators? And the answer is yes and no. Maybe. So let me explain. If you are looking at NVIDIA card, which has the awesome support for 3D software, then AMD has absolutely no competition there for NVIDIA. It's so much better in every single 3D application, and the support, the performance, everything's better on the NVIDIA card. Less power draw, cheaper, everything's good. Now, if we are looking at the video editing applications, then that's not quite so straightforward, because the AMD card has very, very good media engines and can be quite a bit faster in Premiere Pro, as well as DaVinci Resolve and even photo editing really in Photoshop. So if you're doing long GOP or interframe codecs, or if you're using them, then the AMD card is better pick if you have a stable driver. Now, AMD is known to have a little bit less stable drivers compared to the NVIDIA one, because on NVIDIA we have studio drivers. And if you're a professional creator, perhaps that is important to you to have a more stable system, as well as better quality encoding, which NVIDIA is also known for. Both of these cards on AMD and NVIDIA support AV1 decoding and have multiple media engines inside, but I think in terms of quality of video and stability, the NVIDIA trumps AMD. But in terms of pure performance, AMD is better, and the drivers are getting more and more stable, which is interesting. But the good news is that the 4080 Super now is more affordable, and we can get the card at a lower price point. There's still 4080s being sold at $1,400+, which is absolutely insane price point, and they should be around $1,000, which this 4080 now should be, and let's hope they will be. All in all, I'm happy with the 4080 Super performance, just to get a better card. Nothing design wise has changed, we're just getting a better card at a lower price point. Now, if someone's charging you more for the 4080 Super than the 4080, then don't buy it. Obviously, that's a scam. It shouldn't be that. 4080 Super should be lower and cheaper. Now, if you do want to build yourself the best bang for buck creator PC though, there's build guides in the description below. Feel free to check them out, and I'll explain everything down there. Now, after watching this video, perhaps the 4080 you might want to swap out with a 4080 Super, and that will be a better option for you there, okay? Yeah? Thanks guys for watching. Bye-bye.